Good afternoon. We'll call this meeting of the Joint Legislative Audit Review Committee I-900 Subcommittee Public Hearing to order. The State Auditor will be presenting their recent report, School Nutrition, following up on lunch scheduling guidance. Staff from the State Auditor's Office will give this presentation of their recent performance audit. The audit is being discussed at this hearing was conducted solely and independently by the State Auditor's Office under the authority of legislation approved by the voters in Initiative 900. The State Auditor is elected directly by the people of the State of Washington and operates independently of the Legislature and the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee. JLARC members attending virtually can let me know during the presentation if they have any questions. They can use the raise hand feature in Zoom, or you can just wave your hand and we'll see you. After the presentation, agency staff will provide comments on the audit report, and members will have an opportunity to ask them questions. We'll be taking public testimony after the presentation. So far, we have no one signed up for public comment, but I do want to make sure people know that if they do have comment following this, they can still submit comments in writing. And staff have supplied information on registering for in-person and remote public testimony via Zoom, and that's on the JLARC website. With that, I will turn it over to the State Auditor's Office. And they are with us remotely, so please proceed when you're ready. We're not hearing you. I think you have to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
We can, thank you. Please proceed.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, Chair, members of the committee. My name is Holland Kitchell. I'm a performance auditor with the Washington State Auditor's Office. Today, I'm here to present you the results of our performance audit on school nutrition, which is a follow-up on a 2019 audit. Before I begin, I'd like to thank OSPI for the information and assistance they provided throughout the audit. Next slide, please. Our 2019 audit on school nutrition compared lunch practices at Washington elementary schools to two leading practices, having at least 20 minutes of seated lunchtime and scheduling recess before lunch. At the time, we found that most schools that we surveyed or observed did not apply either practice. The challenges that schools faced in adopting these practices are the same as today, which I'll discuss in more detail later. OSPI plays a role in influencing student lunch practices, including ensuring that schools adhere to nutrition standards for food served in schools. Next slide. We followed up with OSPI staff to see whether they had implemented recommendations made in the previous audit. OSPI is currently in the process of implementing those recommendations, including they're in the early stages of proposing 20 minutes of seat time for lunch as a statewide rule, and they will issue guidance on the new seated lunchtime rule if adopted, but have provided only minimal information about scheduling recess before lunch. And OSPI's work with stakeholders has focused on seated lunchtime, less so on recess scheduling. Next slide. We followed up on these recommendations to OSPI because students having enough time to eat lunch is an ongoing concern of parents. Research shows that students who have longer seat times and recess before lunch eat healthier, waste less food, and develop positive habits around meal times. We followed up on 3 recommendations that we made to OSPI in the 2019 audit, including revised state rules to define a minimum amount of seat time for lunch, develop and share guidance around both 20 minutes of seated lunchtime and scheduling recess before lunch, and work with stakeholders to identify solutions to scheduling barriers. The audit did not evaluate recommendations made to school districts in the previous audit. We also did not evaluate whether any additional school districts have implemented 20 minutes of seated lunchtime or recess before lunch since the previous audit. Next slide, please. OSPI has proposed a statewide rule requiring 20 minutes of seated lunchtime, consistent with leading practices. OSPI started work on adopting this rule in late 2019, but its efforts were delayed due to the pandemic. In August 2024, OSPI restarted the process to update the rule. A few weeks ago, OSPI held a public hearing where educators and parents shared both support and concerns about this potential rule change. Schools would be required to implement the 20-minute seated lunchtime rule starting in the 2025-2026 school year if OSPI's proposed rule is adopted. Next slide, please. OSPI has not yet developed written guidance for 20-minute seated lunchtime as recommended in the previous audit. This is because they plan to develop and distribute guidance if the rule is adopted. Next slide, please. We also recommended in the previous audit that OSPI develop guidance for schools related to recess before lunch. OSPI recommended recess before lunch in its spring 2024 bulletin to school officials, but agency staff said they do not plan to develop guidance because they do not plan to make scheduling recess before lunch a statewide rule at this time. This is because schools face several challenges in scheduling, including ensuring sufficient instructional time and mandatory breaks for teachers, too few supervisory staff to monitor recess and lunch, and limited bathroom facilities, which can create bottlenecks when students need to wash their hands after coming in from recess. Next slide, please. OSPI has met with stakeholders, including the Washington Association of School Business Officials and the Washington School Nutrition Association as part of the process of implementing the 20-minute seated lunchtime rule. Agency staff said they will address any of their concerns as part of updating the rule. They said they've also discussed scheduling recess before lunch as part of this process, but to a lesser extent than seated lunchtime. This is because they do not plan to make it a requirement at this time due to the scheduling challenges mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. This audit makes no new recommendations. This concludes our presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. We don't have any members online, just the two of us here. Apparently all the other members are taking their 20 minutes for lunch as we are doing this during the noon hour. Do you have any questions? Representative Paulette.
Thank you. What's for lunch? We'll be here all lunch hour.
No, we won't. As soon as this meeting's over with, I'm going to go eat lunch. So
I do have a question. Are we, which may be for OSPI if they're available to respond to a question.
If we could get OSPI staff to come on up. Please introduce yourself. And then if we can get the state auditor's office to stay online in case they want to answer any of the questions that come up.
Good afternoon. My name is Leanne Echo. I'm the Chief Nutrition Officer at OSPI, and I'm also a registered dietitian, so I can tell you what's for lunch.
Or what should be for lunch.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Chair, members of the committee. For the record, Misha Chernisky, also with OSPI. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you for being here. Representative Paulette.
Now for an actual serious question. Is peanut butter and jelly for lunch healthy? In terms of 20 minutes as a recommendation, if the legislature, per the request of OSPI, proceeds to looking at school lunches for everyone, what would be the implication in terms of timing necessary to be able to ensure that every child has time for a nutritious lunch?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is one of the challenges that we heard during the public comments from school districts. I think the overarching theme where people were absolutely supportive of the concept of having that amount of time for children to eat their lunch, but it was the dynamics, the infrastructure of lunchrooms, of sharing space, of staff supervision that was the challenge. So, of course, if we have more kids consuming meals during the mealtime, that could impact it. I will say, though, regardless if they're eating a school lunch or a lunch from home, they've all still got to sit down and eat. So maybe not as much as one would think, but you are trying to move more children through a serving line to receive the meal.
I'll just add one quick thing here. One of the benefits of universal meals is that usually you can do a simpler meal counting system. So instead of having students come by maybe with a card that they scan or they put in a number, you can just count all the students that take a reimbursable meal. So there is that benefit. So I think it probably comes out as a wash, or maybe it's a little bit less than a wash, but there is that benefit of universal meals. You can speed up the meal service line. But again, like Leanne mentioned, you still have the logistics of having all those kids sit and making sure that there's capacity for all that.
Any additional questions? Okay. Is there any additional information you want to present to us regarding this?
Not at this time. We really appreciate the follow-up of the audit and all your time. We're taking in the comments that we received. We received, I think it was over 150 written comments. There was about 2 hours of public hearing that we had during our rulemaking process. So a lot of really great input. Again, like Leanne mentioned, everybody I think was in favor of the idea of it. It was just that the logistics, the challenges of this year. We know that school districts have a lot on their plates right now, no pun intended. And so we're kind of taking that on, and then we'll move forward soon.
Okay. Well, thank you. My understanding is we have nobody signed up for public testimony. So that pretty well concludes our business for today. I will note that, remind the audience that anyone wishing to provide written testimony on today's agenda topic can submit comments to jlarc@leg.wa.gov. And if you can just remember, Legislature Washington Government, leg.wa.gov. It's jlarc@leg.wa.gov. Or you can mail them to P.O. Box 40910. Again, that's P.O. Box 40910, Olympia, Washington, 98504. And again, if you go to leg.wa.gov, you can look up all of this stuff and way more. So if you have comments, please go ahead and log on and send those in to us. And we'll make sure that that gets out to all of the members of JLARC. So thank you all for being here. And with that, we are adjourned.